Hey, good morning, everybody, and welcome back. Welcome for the first time, whichever that is for you. This is the Mic Drop Show. This is where I'm at every Wednesday morning at 7:30 Pacific, 9:30 Central, where we take a closer look at the framework that actually protects investors. Hey, on the Mic Drop Show, we bring clarity and structure to real estate and financial strategy. I'm Mike Morawski. As I said, I'm here every week. Glad that you're back with us or joining us for the first time. And if somebody told you about this show, thank them, because you're going to want to buckle up this morning as we dig into some of this strategy and take a look at some of the framework and build some of that out for you. Today I want to talk about something that doesn't get discussed nearly enough in real estate circles. The difference between activity and judgment. A lot of times you can judge someone else's activity or even your own activity, which could be a lot, might not be a lot, but you really want to take a deep look at it. Right now, a lot of investors are involved in activity, right? They're underwriting deals. They might be out networking. They might be capital raising, and they're chasing the next opportunity, which I think right now is a perfect time to be chasing the next opportunity. I firmly believe we're at the bottom of this market cycle. And as things continue to grow over the next couple of months here, you're going to be glad you got involved today in real estate and able to take advantage of the changing cycle. I've been in the business over 30 years, and I've said for 3 decades, boy, if I could just get involved at the beginning before the news and the media say that things have changed and be involved from day one, the structure you can create around that and the framework that you can bring to deals is huge. But being active in the market and exercising good judgment, they're not the same thing. They're confusing. And the two of them could create some real risks for you. Most of the mistakes I see in real estate don't happen because people are lazy. They happen because people are moving too quickly without with being incomplete in their thought process and their judgments. The industry rewards momentum. Things like podcasts, where you can celebrate your acquisitions, conferences where you highlight your growth and other people's growth, networking events. What rarely gets highlighted is the discipline around when not to move, right? Sometimes it's okay to say no. Sometimes it's okay just to sit back and just wait. But you know what? We're entering a time where it's not okay to sit back anymore. You definitely have to start to take the activity and get involved. You know what? This is where real professionals separate themselves from everyone else. This is where the serious investors separate themselves from everyone else. Because in this business, the biggest financial damage rarely comes from what you miss. It comes from what you should have passed on, right? How can you say no? How often should you say no? Not every deal you underwrite out there makes sense. Not every deal you enter into out there is going to be the right deal or going to make sense. There's this big misconception that experience in real estate is mostly about knowing what to do. It's not. Experience is mostly knowing about what not to touch. When you learn that through time, through experience, you see this especially with newer investors who believe that the goal is to stay active in the market all the time. And that's not necessarily true. You could stay active underwriting. I told somebody this week on a coaching call, I said, before we bought a portfolio in a market, we spent probably 6 months underwriting about 100 other deals and saying no to a lot of those deals. We've talked to a number of investors and said, no, we don't want them to invest with us because of their expectations and their ideas of wanting to change structure. People assume that if you're buying or if you're not buying, that you're falling behind. That's not necessarily true. You're just acting smart. If you're not raising capital, you're losing momentum. Well, sometimes you might not have a place to raise capital to, but you need to be having the conversations and building the relationships and building the network, expanding and continuing to build your circle of influence, but markets don't reward just activity alone. Markets reward timing, restraint, and your structure, right? I talk a lot about structure, and structure is how do we create a win-win situation in the deal, in any deal, right? Whether it's a residential deal, whether it's a multifamily deal, how do you create the best terms, and timing those terms can help too. If you can get a seller to do maybe some creative financing for you and with you and partner with you on a deal, and you can run those terms out for 5, 10, 20 years, boy, that timing really helps. And if a deal works better that way and doesn't work great, having to have to go get a new mortgage today, well, then the restraint of not doing that deal because you weren't able to put a good structure in place could be something to really take into consideration. Investors who survive multiple cycles are rarely the most aggressive people in the room. Take a look at Warren Buffett. There's plenty of times that he just sits back and he waits, and some of the things that Warren Buffett has said has been like, when everybody's going or running from in fear, you should run to what they're running from, right? If people are walking away from deals, maybe they're deals you should look at and walk towards. Some of these investors are the ones who are comfortably sitting still when the risk profile doesn't make sense. So think about that. Are you taking a look at the risk profile, and what's your risk profile? I think there's two things that we look at there. We have to look at what our risk profile is. What are we willing to do? What are we willing to risk? Time, effort, money, opportunity, lost opportunity. There's a lot to be said for lost opportunity versus what is the risk in the market. I think today the risk is minimal in the market, right? And if you're picking the right market and you've got a strong deal with some great fundamentals and maybe even opportunity that you can turn around operational performance or physical processes and performance on a property, over time, you'll start to realize something important about real estate. Most deals don't fail because the math was wrong. They fail because people's judgment was compromised, right? Can you agree with that point? That deals don't fail because the math was wrong? Because really, I have a great friend in the business, and he always says to me, he goes, the math never lies. They fail because their judgment was wrong and compromised. Maybe the operator stretched assumptions a little too long. I had this conversation yesterday with someone. I said, hey, we can make this deal look better, right? We can give the seller what they want in price, and we can exaggerate the rent growth. We can exaggerate expense reduction. We can exaggerate exit cap rate. And those things will make the deal look good, but can we really perform? Or are we better off telling the seller honestly, listen, we can only pay you on current operations and not exaggerate those other items? Maybe the timeline is something else to take a look at. One of the things that I really look at when I'm looking at a deal is what is my investor going to get, right? It's about my investor. And how can I perform for my investor's future wealth and generational wealth and their cash flow? And time cures that. Realistic expectations cure that. None of this other stuff matters. So show up until obvious problems start to show up, and they'll show up in the beginning. We've taken over deals that we bought the due diligence checked out and things checked out. But when we really got into it, it was a totally different ball game. So you need to really be paying attention to a lot more than just the math or just what you think you can do. Experienced investors recognize something very subtle. They recognize when too many things have gone right, and that's usually the signal to step back. It's kind of controversial, wouldn't you say? If they recognize too many things are going in the right direction, that they have to step back and take another look. One of the disciplines professionals develop is the ability to quietly walk away from an opportunity that looks exciting on the surface, but carry hidden structural risk. So let me say that again, because I think that's really important. One of the disciplines professionals develop is the ability to quietly walk away from opportunities that look exciting on the surface, but carry hidden structural risk, inherent risks that aren't really noticeable on the surface, but when you get into it, they show up. Not because the deal was guaranteed to fail, because the margins for error were way too thin. It's like people talk about cash flow, cash flow, cash flow. But does that mean you should go buy a single family house and have $50 or $100 a month in cash flow? No. No matter the structure, no matter the terms, if you don't have enough cash flow that you can build up so that, when a furnace goes out or a roof needs to be replaced, it doesn't wipe you out, you need to reevaluate that situation. Real estate, the thin margins eventually expose themselves, and you can run into a lot of issues. Sometimes they show up slowly, sometimes they show up all at once. Now, the mistake people make is when they hear conversations like, this is assuming, the answer is simple to most, to being more cautious, right? Listen, when we bring an opportunity to the market for our investors to look at, they're all assumptions, right? Everybody has to do their own due diligence on a deal to make sure that it's going to be work within their risk profile, that our assumptions are something that they might assume or look at differently. And then I want to just say that caution alone doesn't protect every investment. Caution alone doesn't protect investors. Judgment of those deals comes from structured evaluation, experienced across market cycles, and disciplined framework. If you have a good, solid framework, it's easy to say no. Those things, though, take time to build and to develop. And more importantly, they require context that most people don't see when they're just analyzing deals on their own. This is where DIY investing, do-it-yourself investing becomes dangerous, right? A lot of times people think, oh, I can go just do this myself, when in reality says, no, you should have some more eyes and ears around you. You should be listening to other people. Because the market will happily allow you to learn these lessons with your real capital or other people's capital. And it's very expensive classroom. You think that going to a coaching class or taking a year-long coaching program or being in a partnership program that might cost you $5 or $10 or $20,000 is expensive. Well, wait till you get into a deal and put that money in a deal and wind up with mistakes. This is exactly why I spend time walking through this full context. Hey, I have a private session coming up, a free uh, 2-hour masterclass on March 18th. Not to teach people how to chase deals, but to help them understand how professionals think about risk, structure, and long-term positioning before capital ever enters the market or ever enters a deal. Because once money's deployed, most of the important decisions have already been made. And what we want to avoid is making the wrong decisions, even if we think it's important. Real estate isn't about finding the better opportunities or most opportunities. It's about developing the judgment, the framework, the structure to recognize which opportunities actually deserve your capital. Discipline takes time. It takes experience. It takes knowledge. I bring people into a couple of different coaching programs that I work with them on. And, one of the questions people always ask is, how long is it going to take me to do my first deal? And my response always is, how disciplined are you? And how much framework can you build? How much education can you get to build a solid foundation to go out and do your first deal? And I've had coaching clients in the first 3 weeks, 3 months, 6 months do their first deal. And then I've had some that it's taken a year. Well, it's because they build this foundation, this framework a little bit differently in their own world. They're the ones that understand when restraint is the smartest decision to make. That restraint in the room is the smartest person in that room. All right. That's it for today's episode. A little controversy, a little bit of knowledge, a little bit of information, but you know what? Here's the first step. I want you to walk through the full context of all of this with me. Join me for my free live masterclass that's coming up on Wednesday, March 18th at 7:30 Pacific, 9:30 Central Time. I'm sorry. It's at 6 o'clock Central Time on March 18th. I want you to jump in with me for 2 hours, get some information that will help you build a framework for terms, for structure, for processes in some creative financing, little or no money down deals. And boy, I'll tell you what, we have bought single family to 400 unit apartment complexes with little and no money down. So I'm going to teach how to do that. I'm going to teach a little bit about how to look at multifamily deals. So join us on March 18th for the masterclass. The link will be in the description. You'll be able to register and be there. Remember, we're here every Wednesday morning for the Mic Drop Show. Thanks for joining us today. We'll see you next Wednesday again at 7:30 Pacific and 9:30 Central. And if you need anything, just reach out. You know what? Follow us on LinkedIn, Instagram, YouTube, subscribe to our channel. Wherever you're at, we're bringing you great content that's going to help you grow and help you grow personally and professionally. Thanks, everybody. Have a great week, and we will definitely look forward to seeing you soon.